Friends of Volumetrica, welcome Eduardo Buratini. In this video analysis for September 11th, the S and AMP wink with tongue sticking out 500 in NASDAQ. So we've probably reached a turning point for the S and AMP wink with tongue sticking out 500, because in yesterday's session, first of all, we hit new highs. Okay? So the trend in the end, well, in these last two sessions has been bullish, and we've managed to set a new all-time high at 6,565. It's very important to note for the S and AMP wink with tongue sticking out 500 that these new all-time highs were basically reached right at the opening of yesterday's session. And right at the open, within the first half hour, let's say, we saw the creation of this peak, and then for the rest of the session, trading took place below the opening level. So it basically went back to retest the closing levels from Tuesday's session. And this in itself is already quite an important signal because it clearly shows, let's say it effectively demonstrates what was basically an attempt at building momentum, a significant push to continue higher that ultimately failed. And we can clearly see this both from the volume and order flow perspective, because from a purely volumetric analysis point of view, we see that the entire swing that led to the creation of this high, notice how a lot of volume actually built up right at the top of this swing. The POC of the reference swing was actually moved here in order to have in effect, a rebalancing of the underlying part compared to what was the POC of the move. So essentially, this indicates acceptance, yes, but also a battle, a struggle, and ultimately failure. How do we see the failure of this action? From the short pressure that emerged precisely during the creation of this high, which then led to covering not only the overnight gap, but also almost the entire RTH session from yesterday, basically in a completely bearish direction. You can see how the price created a sort of channel between what was its VWAP. The VWAP basically acted as the upper limit, as the upper trend line for this entire move. And there's also something else to point out. If we look at another detail, specifically the order flow here on the chart, this one is a bit more medium term. You can see how the price was pushing upward with some bullish pressure, right? Right at the moment when it went on to make the high. And this bullish pressure completely faded away. And in response, bearish momentum came in. So this is definitely a signal that can't be ignored, especially as it happened right when what is, at this point, the all-time high was being formed. Well, this for sure, and not only that, the session then actually evolved by going back to reaccept, to retest, well, what is the area near the weekly VWAP? But in fact, we also see that we've dropped back below what is the +1 standard deviation, again derived from the weekly VWAP. So this definitely, with the final close in the end, below the day's POC. So let's say there are several signs of weakness combined together. So what does this lead me to expect for, what should I expect for today, for today's session? Well, certainly, we might have finished, let's say, the phase, always looking at the session. We're not talking about the long term because the long term is obviously in a pure uptrend. But we have a session that could easily, try to find a new balance at lower levels. So ideally, the most likely levels for their potentially attractive action at first and possibly supportive action later are definitely 6,000, 6,520, the round number of 6,500, and then subsequently 6,495, which acts as a former support that just 2 days ago, we relied on to kick off this movement. So let's say the whole macro area of 6,506, 406 for 95 still continues to serve its supportive function. Generally, in terms of resistance, the most important resistance has formed right around these rejection actions, where the bullish push immediately turned into a bearish push. So 6,000,6,550, which also acts as a round number level. And I expect from today's session to see the price, so to speak, trapped between these two zones, both equally important. So basically, I expect what could be a continuation of this pullback from the highs for a market that might stay in a distribution area if it keeps holding that 6,500 level. And here, of course, we need to carefully and thoroughly assess what could potentially happen next, because the significant 6,500 level still remains the most critically important support line that can definitively determine whether the current uptrend is successfully maintained, even, let's say, in the broader medium term, so extending well beyond just a single trading session, or if it could, in fact, mark the definitive beginning of a new and sustained downward trend. Clearly, to properly assess it, we'll have to see if and when we get there, basically how this area will be traded and whether it will eventually be broken or held. Let's take a look at the Nasdaq. The Nasdaq didn't have such a significant breakout, at least from a relative point of view, because on the Nasdaq, as we can see, the move that created a new all-time high on the S and AMP wink with tongue sticking out basically resulted in a failed double top on the Nasdaq. Let's just say it was really close. Okay. But in any case, this doesn't change the fact that it was still a move that matched what the volumes were suggesting, because basically from 23,700 we started moving up again and broke through the most important volume resistance levels to reach, once again, a zone very close to, actually above 24,000. Yesterday, we hit a high at 24,045, 24,050. So let's just say 24,000. Roughly speaking. And from there, we saw the price make the exact same rejection as the S and AMP wink with tongue sticking out. Actually, I'd even say it was maybe a bit stronger here, because not only did we see the same exact order flow signals, but we also had areas of bearish pressure here, more than one, in fact, if we look at it intraday. Here they are, 23,970, 23,900, and then another at 23,863. So all in all, this is an even stronger, even clearer signal. All of this also managed to break through a previous area of bullish pressure, where the price had initially tried to bounce during yesterday's session. So in itself, the support was felt. The bearish pressure that broke out afterwards managed to completely break through this support, bringing it from the +1 deviation to the -1 deviation of the weekly VWAP. And basically, we can also see this from the volume profile of yesterday's session. The acceptance above 23,980 completely failed. You can see here that we almost have a tail on the volume profile, with the value area staying entirely below, effectively establishing this high volume node with today's session POC, which is still a confirmation of what could become or remain the new point of equilibrium. So here too, we have a Nasdaq that has definitely confirmed itself as weaker compared to the S and AMP wink with tongue sticking out. And at the moment we find it within a range between the most important resistance area, certainly 23,930, the POC from yesterday's session, and around 23,970, which is the upper part of yesterday's value area. We can see that these correspond to the areas of bearish pressure and the most supportive zones. Well, let's say that here we really need to carefully consider what was the low of yesterday's session, because actually, both from a composite profile perspective and from a weekly narrative point of view, we have a particularly important area here. So even in this case, I expect the market will generally keep looking for new support levels, even lower if necessary. Okay. But ideally, it's still a market that's within its distribution phase. So even here, we can't say that the bullish narrative has been completely invalidated. We're in a period of correction and possibly consolidation. A correction that would become much more significant as an idea of a possible deeper trend dip if we were to see, at least initially here, an acceptance below 23,700. Okay. So we would need to break what was also the low from 2 days ago and start trading within this low volume area. We're definitely much farther from that compared to the S and AMP wink with tongue sticking out. So let's see what the market gives us, what it will give us today during the session. Obviously, I remind you that all these analyses are for educational and informational purposes only, and are absolutely not an incentive to take positions based on this analysis. I thank you in advance for your attention, wish you a good day, and happy trading.